This video covers cranial bones to know. So we're going to go ahead and start with, we're going right into it, aren't we? Actually, let me name some of the superficial bones first, and then we'll go into some of the deep bones. So this is the anterior view of the skull. I'm in Module 5, the skeletal system. I'm looking at the skull from the currently anterior view. From here we can see the frontal bone, the nasal bone. This is the maxilla. Deeper in here is going to be the lacrimal bone. There's several different bones that comprise the orbit. We can see a little bit of parietal here, a little bit of temporal here, and the mandible here as well. Now I'll go ahead and show you the lateral view. Here's the temporal bone. I'm going to get rid of these attachment sites because you may not necessarily have those visual reference points when you're being tested on it. So you have your temporal bone here. This is known as the squamosal suture. And that's going to separate the temporal bone here from the parietal, a little bit occipital. Let's just say to the parietal bone. This is the sphenoid bone over here, just the outside portion of the sphenoid bone here. So here's the temporal bone all the way up to here. This line right here is the juncture of the temporal bone to the zygomatic bone right there. So again, frontal bone, parietal, occipital, temporal, nasal, maxilla. Here, lacrimal has this little divot in it right there, and the mandible right there. So that's just a superficial view. We should also be able to see, let's see if it's going to give us the internal deep view. No, we'll have to go to a different segment. Cranial cavity is going to have this view that I need right now. So our first specific bone from the bony structures to know list is going to be the cranial and facial bone, starting with the ethmoid bone, which is right here. So let's go ahead and just highlight that ethmoid bone right there. We're going to have to go to a different view to select it specifically because it's a little bit harder to appreciate. While we're up here though, the rest of this is frontal bone, so part of the ethmoid is obscured by the frontal bone here. This is the suture dividing the frontal bone from, in this case, the sphenoid bone. This cool looking thing right here is the sphenoid bone. It goes all the way out to here. These holes, these foramen is the word for holes, are in the sphenoid bone. So this is all sphenoid. This is the inside of the temporal bone right here. This is the inside of the occipital bone. This is the foramen magnum from the inside. So let's go ahead and do a specific ethmoid bone view. And superior and posterior. Here's our superior view. What you were looking at just a minute ago, looking into the cranial cavity from above, from the superior orientation. This is the superior view of the ethmoid bone. This is known as the crista galli, and that's the same as this structure right here, but this is the posterior view. So this was what you were just looking at. This was what was obscured by the frontal bone out here. So you actually have these, they're called air sacs. You have ethmoidal air sacs, and the membranes kind of rot away after death, and so you can't preserve them in bone, and you're left with these sort of like lacy, delicate labyrinth of air space, and that's what's out here. Let's see, so from the posterior view, you've got this bony prominence right here known as the crista galli. It literally translates to the rooster's comb. So you know how roosters have that like red flappy thing on the top of their head? That's a crista galli, and that's what this is named after. A lateral view would be helpful because it's just on a small portion of it, almost like a fin. This is the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid, and I think that's the only feature that's actually on your list. I don't think you have crista galli. I'm pointing it out anyway, just because it's crista galli, just because it's going to come up in the future. But that perpendicular plate, the reason it's on the list is it makes up your nasal septum. Part of your nasal septum is from that perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. So down here, this is inside your nasal cavity. Up here, this is inside your cranial cavity, so it's kind of a dividing line there. Okay, let's go specifically to the frontal bone. Nice, completely random order we're going in here. Oh, I think it's alphabetical, that's why. Okay, here's your frontal bone. And this is the anterior view of the frontal bone, so it's basically your forehead, and it does have a sort of orbital component, so it helps make up the orbit, the eye socket. Let's see, frontal, and it's just frontal bone, identifying the frontal bone. The anterior is the best view for that anyway. I'm comfortable with that. Let's go ahead on to the lacrimal bone. Do we have a separate lacrimal? No, let's go to the skull in general, lateral view, and take those attachment sites off. I mentioned earlier lacrimal bone. It's just a sort of rectangular bone right here. Okay, there you go. There's lacrimal, and it has this little divot in it. In fact, I actually disagree of how they've highlighted that. That entire divot should be on the lacrimal bone. It's actually a foramen. There's something called the lacrimal duct. When your eyes produce tears, they actually drain through that lacrimal duct. So we're actually forming tears sort of superlaterally, and they're draining medially into that lacrimal bone. Okay, lacrimal, where are we? Mandible. Sure, why not? Let's go to the mandible here. Here's a good lateral view of the mandible, and it's just identifying the mandible. So that's going to be your jaw. There's only one. It's not a paired structure. And we only have a lateral view. Okay, that's fine. The mandible, the maxilla, I've pointed out a couple of different times. Now that's actually a paired structure. So you can see I was orienting that order for you before with the nasal bones, maxilla, and then lacrimal. And that's the reason why I was helping orient. You have this process up here that goes all the way up to this frontal bone. And so that sticks up quite high, but it is the rest of this portion of your face, including all of your upper teeth, but it's a paired structure. So when you separate this in half, and what they've done is, they've taken one out and they've given you the lateral view of one and the medial view of the other. And that's what you're looking at. So this is actually a component of your hard palate right here. You have a palatine bone as well, which I don't think is on your list, unfortunately. And that's what your hard palate is. And then you have some soft tissue that makes up your soft palate. So again, this is separating the nasal cavity up here from the oral cavity down here. And that's your maxillary sinus right there, that little gap right there. This is a lateral view. So you'd have your zygomatic bone here, your frontal bone here. So this is the view from the side, is what you're looking at. Okay, that is the maxilla. Next up was that nasal bone. So I, again, have to go back to that view of the skull, anterior view, and I've been orienting these two bones are the nasal bones. Let's highlight that. Oops, that's nasal concha. There you go, nasal bones right there. So again, I like to just keep them in order in my head. Nasal, maxilla, lacrimal, just in that order. Is there anything to that? No, there's not. So let's move on to the occipital bone. So this is basically the back of your skull. It's also on the inferior surface of your skull, is something I think we don't always get. Let's get a lateral view. We can't get a lateral view. It's not going to do that for us. But you know what we do have? This guy right here. This is why I have my own skeleton. So here's the occipital bone. I'll orient it so that it looks more or less the same as the way it's being portrayed here. There we go. But then I'm going to give you a lateral view so that you can appreciate. So put my hand on the occipital bone here, goes all the way to there. That's all occipital bone, all the way up to this. That's called the lambdoidal suture right here. So he's on the inferior as well as posterior surface of the skull. And we do have this big hole right here known as the foramen magnum, which I think is a hilarious name because the literal translation from that is big hole. Somebody saw that, some ancient, extremely elite person saw that and thought, what shall we name this? Big hole. And somebody else who was also very elite and very, very smart, or at least considered to be so, said, let's call it the big hole and have an early lunch. And that's how they decided on that. That's how I imagined that going down. So foramen magnum, big hole. Moving on to the parietal bone. It's just, I love it. It's one of my favorite things to translate. Okay, aside from, there's something in the heart called trabeculae carnae, which is even funnier to translate directly. If you speak Spanish, you've probably got about half of that already, carne. Okay, so let's see. Parietal bone is where we're at. Parietal bone. Parietal translates to wall. Look at this big, not exactly flat. It's got some curvature to it, as you can see right here. But in terms of our flat bones, it's pretty broad and flat. So they named it wall. It's just that the word for wall is parietal. And there are very few structures on this to know. There are two of them that is a paired structure. The sphenoid bone is one of my personal favorites. I just love the sphenoid bone. It's so pretty. I did show you the sphenoid bone inside the cranial cavity. So again, you take off the crown of the skull, you look inside of the head, and you end up with, I mentioned some of those, let me make sure I'm pointing to the correct foramina. Some of those little foramina in there are these little foramina in here. And you can see these processes right here are the same as these processes right here. So this is inside of your skull, and it's supporting some very, very specific structures of your brain. So your temporal lobe would be here, your pituitary gland would be here. That's why that's going to be important for you in the future. I just think it's a really beautiful bone. It looks like a butterfly to me, and that's what sphenoid means, is butterfly. And even though that's the direct translation, sphenoid is butterfly, I actually had some students who were studying the sphenoid bone come up with a story of the Mothman. They think it looks more like a moth, and I kind of agree. That looks like fuzzy little antennae, except that this is known as a wing and that's known as a wing in terms of the anatomy, so it does cause some problems later. So for now, it's just identifying the sphenoid bone. This portion right here of the greater wing is on the exterior surface, so you can see a little bit of the sphenoid from out here. Okay, let's see, sutures. Now again, to see sutures, we need to go back to the skull. Let's start with a superior view. This is the frontal bone, and these are the parietal bones. So this is the coronal suture. Make sure, yes. And then separating the two parietal bones is the sagittal suture. Now we already have our plane for this. This is the mid-sagittal plane, and this is in fact the coronal plane. Separating anterior to posterior is the coronal plane. Separating right and left is the sagittal plane. And not surprisingly, we have sutures that go along with that plan, which is pretty cool. I'm on board. I hope you are too. There are a lot of other sutures. I already showed you the squamosal suture and the lambdoidal suture, but they're not on the list right now. Temporal bone is a pretty cool bone. There's a lot of features, but you don't really have to know all of them right now. Probably the two most important ones, and I agree with this list on this assessment list. Here's your temporal bone from the lateral view. So we're looking at, put his cranium back on. Okay, we're looking at him from the lateral view. We're looking at the temporal bone here, and this little thing sticking straight out. You know, let me go this way so that it matches more closely to what you're looking at. Right here is temporal. So that's the external auditory meatus. Yes, external auditory meatus, and that's just your ear hole. That's what that means. You do have an internal auditory meatus. It's right there. It doesn't go all the way through in a living person. There's a membrane to separate it, but and also a lot of structures within this bony mass right here. I think the temporal bone is one of the harder things to visually understand in pictures. I think it's something that you need to hold in your hand, and unfortunately I can't just send a bag of bones to your house. So you'll have to trust me that this is a big, bony, solid thing right here, whereas this is like a flat, sort of tiny, thin thing right here. Okay, so there's that external auditory meatus, and then of significance to you is the mastoid process of the temporal bone here. So you have this big, massive, bony outcropping here. It's nice and shaded. Not that one, this one. It's nice and shaded. This big old thing is honker. Anytime you have these rugosities, is the phrase for them, anytime you have these roughened outcroppings known as rugosities, that's an attachment site. And this one is a particularly important point of reference for you, both because it's an attachment site for a very important muscle known as the sternocleidomastoid, but also because there is a suture you may learn one day known as the occipitomastoid suture, and that's between the occipital bone and the mastoid process. So it's just such a big feature that we'll use it as a reference point for a lot of different things. You can palpate your own mastoid process. So if you find your sternocleidomastoid muscle and follow it back up, there should be a little bony protrusion that you can kind of poke at. Don't poke at your styloid process. That thing's a little on the fragile side. If you ever have a real skeleton, one thing that happens in bone labs, if you're trying to like protect delicate bones from students, the styloid process always breaks off. That's, again, not on your list. I'm just showing it for fun. Vomer. Do we have a separate vomer? I don't think this has a separate vomer, but if we go skull anterior view, get rid of the attachments, vomer. So I mentioned in that ethmoid bone that we have that perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone making up part of the nasal septum. The vomer makes up the rest of the nasal septum. So if you've ever heard somebody say, I've got a deviated septum, what they mean is somewhere between that vomer and that perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone, they have a deviation from one side to the other. And these things right here, those are known as nasal conchae. They're covered in soft tissue. They've got a lot of vasculature. They can actually expand and contract. So it's possible between that connective tissue, that soft tissue, and that septum to kind of compress some structures in there. So that can happen and get rather unfortunate. I'm trying to figure out where the light is coming from predominantly and balance out my lighting. Oh, that made it worse. That's fine. So there's your vomer. I don't have a separate view for it. The zygomatic bone is your cheekbone. So you know, oh, this person has really high cheekbones. In fact, this person does have really high cheekbones. I was kind of looking at the skull in general and thinking this is a pretty extreme skull, actually. He's just got a very sloped forehead, but he's got really soft rugosities. Compare that mastoid process to the way this guy's mastoid process looks in terms of rugosity and how far it sticks down. So he's really smooth, which is like effeminate, but he's got like a really wide jaw, which is really masculine, and then he's got this really, really far sloped forehead. So compare the slope of his forehead to this skull slope of the forehead. That angle right there versus he's like more like that. So, and he's pretty long in this direction, but kind of short in this direction. He's an interesting guy. And definitely male. But young. But also like stupidly perfect teeth. I was like actually kind of bothered by how perfect his teeth are. So for example, actually let's do inferior view of the skull. So perfect teeth, number one, no cavities. He doesn't grind his teeth, and also he's got perfect third molars, which is the wisdom tooth. So where did they find this skull? Who's like got a super sloped forehead like an ancient person, but perfect teeth and perfect wisdom teeth. He's never had a tooth fall out, he's never had a cavity, and his wisdom teeth came in without any issue whatsoever. I don't know whose skull this is what I'm saying. Okay, that's actually it for the bony cranium. Sorry, I'm ranting about my own fun stuff.